Hello everyone. The God of this age is a term or an expression found at 2 Corinthians 4:4, which is popularly taken to mean or to refer to the devil or Satan. And I want to show you here in this video why that's just not the case. So let's just get straight into it here, and we'll just have a look at the verse to start. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. 2 Corinthians 4:3-4, and that's a New American Standard translation. So people read this expression, the God of this world, and they suppose, well, that's got to be talking about the devil. And one of the main reasons people sort of naturally do this, especially lay people, is they see a lowercase g. And so they assume, well, that's got to be the devil because it certainly can't be God, or it would be a capital G. First things first is it doesn't really say the God of this world. The word that's usually translated as the word world is the Greek word cosmos. That's not the word here. The word here is ion, and it means, it's generally translated as age. For example, when Jesus says, not in this age or the age to come, okay, that's the word we're talking about here. One of the first things you really got to take notice of is the Greek text. In the Greek text, it says, in whose case ha theos of this age. And then it goes on to say the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of ha theos. Okay? When you see the word ha theos in the New Testament, that's the word that's used for capital G God. And if you really stop and think about it here, if you interpret this to refer to the devil, and the God of this age, you end up with an incoherent statement by Paul. The God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. And then he talks about the glory of Christ, who is the image of ha theos, the image of God. And it's incoherent because it sounds like Paul's saying that Christ is the image of the devil, if in fact you interpret the first instance of ha theos as the devil. And so you really got to ask yourself, well, does this really mean capital G God in the first instance and in the second instance? And if you look at it like this, it becomes coherent. The God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, and Christ is the image of God. You see that? Notice also it says he has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. So what people think here is, well, that's got to be the devil. God our Father wouldn't be blinding people's minds. Well, that's incorrect. First of all, there's two things here. First, it doesn't say he has blinded minds of people so they can't believe or won't believe. It says he has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. Okay, people who already are not believing. The second thing is what the scriptures do say on this matter. So let's start at Matthew 13:13-15, where Jesus is speaking. And the disciples asked Jesus, why do you speak in parables? And this is what he says, this is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see, though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become callous. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. This is a popular quotation in the New Testament, and you'll see the references down there. And it refers to the unbelief People who would not believe in Jesus. Now notice what Jesus said just previous to this. And the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" We've seen Jesus just explain why. Jesus answered them, "To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance, the light of the glory of Christ. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him." Sounds a lot like what Paul is saying at 2 Corinthians 4:4, doesn't it? And again, at Romans 11, Paul says this, "What Israel is seeking it has not obtained, but the chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not," down to this very day. So this idea that, well, that must be the devil because, God couldn't be involved in that, is just not true, as we see in the scriptures. We're reading about what happens to unbelieving people who are already are unbelieving. And we'll see how that plays out a little clearer in a moment here. Notice it says, "He has blinded the minds of the unbelieving." Unbelievers who are perishing. That's who Paul is talking about. Not potential believers, but unbelievers. Now listen to what Paul had just said. "But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart." Okay? Look what he says at 2 Corinthians 4:4. "Even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away." Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. But we, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord the Spirit. You see, that's what he's talking about at 2 Corinthians 4:4. He's still on this same subject. The unbeliever's eyes are veiled. Notice also, compare these things. At 4:4, he says, "The gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." Notice what he said at 3:15-18. "The glory of the Lord," and we are being transformed into the same image. Because Christians are partakers of the divine nature, as Peter says, 2 Peter 1:4. Now look at this. If we go back just a few verses again, "The God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelieving." What did Paul say at 2 Corinthians 3:14-16, just in the previous chapter? "But their minds were hardened. For until this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because it is removed in Christ. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart, but whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away." So you got to see how Paul is not saying, that someone's blinding people so they can't understand or see the gospel. What he's talking about is the people who won't believe, the unbelieving, their minds are veiled. Their minds are veiled in contrast to believers who, their minds are enlightened. They see the light and the glory of Christ because they're believers. And that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about, God blinding people so they can't believe. Notice what it says. Whenever a person turns to the Lord, becomes a believer, the veil is taken away. And then this isn't true anymore. The minds of the unbelieving, they don't see the gospel of the glory of Christ, but if they turn to the Lord, then they do. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. Notice what Paul said in this same letter, and you really got to watch this with Paul. He'll carry an idea through several chapters, and it's not always, readily apparent. For we are to God the scent of Christ, or the aroma of Christ, among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To the one, an aroma from death to death, the ones perishing. To the other, an aroma or a fragrance from life to life. So what Paul is saying is when he preaches the gospel, it has one effect for those who will not believe, and it has another effect for those who will. And I'm pretty sure this is really what he's thinking about. When he says the God of this age, he's talking about what he had just been speaking about in the previous chapter. In chapter 3, he was talking about the law and how it was a ministry of death, and how, their minds were veiled, or their eyes were veiled under the reading of the law. And it's only in Christ that the veil is lifted and you can see the light of the glory of Christ. So he's contrasting that age under the law with the new age under Christ. In other words, there was the ministry of the law, and now there's the ministry of Christ, or the ministry of the gospel, the ministry of life, the ministry of condemnation under the law, the ministry of righteousness in Christ. And he makes all those contrasts in chapter 3. And under the old, veiled. Under the new, the veil is lifted. Okay? And that's the message that he's been talking about by the time he gets to chapter 4, verse 4. Even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. Now, I think probably the right way to understand this passage is like this. If you read it like this is how it makes sense. In whose case God has blinded the minds of the unbelieving of this age. Okay? And he's talking about how Christians see the light of the age to come. And unbelievers can't see that. If we just take a look at how the text reads, it is veiled to those who are perishing. And it literally reads like this: in whose case the God of the age, this, has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. Now, a guy by the name of Irenaeus, about 180 AD, also talked about this. And the Gnostics said, well, this is talking about another God, because they were arguing about, they had these different gods. There was the God, the unknown God, behind the known God kind of idea they had. And so they were making an argument about this, and Irenaeus said, no, this verse is about God, God Most High, the Creator, God our Father. And he talks about that against the work that's most commonly known as Against Heresies, chapter 3, verse 7. And he cites a couple of verses where Paul writes grammatically in a similar manner to this, Galatians 3:19 and 2 Thessalonians 2:8. And he's citing these two verses because he wants to argue that, well, this is kind of just a style Paul has once in a while. And here's a couple of cases that are similar to 2 Corinthians 4:4. And you don't make the same mistake there, so why do you make that mistake here? That's basically Irenaeus' argument. And I have to agree with him on this particular matter. I think Irenaeus is correct. It is talking about God the Father when it says the God of this age. And I think it has to be. Christ is the image of God the Father, right? And if we appreciate what Paul has said in his introductory remarks, for we are to God the Son of Christ among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing, to the one an aroma from death to death, to the other an aroma from life to life. And you remember how he had just been speaking in the previous chapter, in chapter 3, the law was a ministry of death, and now Christians are in the ministry of life. An aroma from death to death, to the other an aroma from life to life. I think when you look at all those facts, it's kind of a no-brainer, really. And if you really think about it, people are sort of practicing eisegesis to say that's the devil. There's really nothing in the context to suppose that Paul is talking about the devil. People are just sort of imagining that idea into the text because that's kind of what their fancies, their theological fancies tell them to do. But as we have seen, it comes with an incoherent statement by Paul. If you're going to say that ho-theos in the first instance is the devil, then it comes out as Paul saying that Christ is the image of the devil, which makes no sense. Just the fact that he's obviously speaking of God the Father in the second instance tells us he's probably talking about God the Father in the first instance, right? And then there's all these other contextual things we've seen. I don't know why academics and scholars would continue to suppose this is referring to the devil and translate it as they do. I mean, personally, I think it's incompetent. I mean, this should be kind of obvious if you're a scholar, like a New Testament scholar who spends all his time studying this and reading the Greek, understanding the context of what Paul is talking about in chapter 3 and in chapter 4, and there's still more stuff that could be said about this. Paul goes on and talks about this further through chapter 4 and into chapter 5. I mean, this is just a brief look at this. And, to suppose this is a lowercase g God of some sort, and lead people to think it's the devil is kind of misleading, because there's no reason to think it should be that, especially in light of the passages we've seen where it says, God does blind the minds of the unbelieving. How does he do that? He sends his servants out to preach the gospel, to one, the aroma of death, to another, the aroma of life, contrasting unbelievers and believers. I don't know what's so hard about it, really, and honestly. It's pretty easy. Maybe for some people, I mean, I can't believe academics would do this, but maybe they do. They're trying to make this Greek come out in English nicely, and so that's, they're thinking in English instead of Greek, and maybe this is what they come up with. I don't know. But really, to have this incoherent sentence where you have the God blinding people, which is supposed to be the devil, and then the next breath you say Christ is the image of the God that you were just talking about. And you have the verse saying that Christ is the image of the devil, basically, by your interpretation and your translation. It seems kind of ridiculous to me. But that's pretty much what you got. If you got a lowercase g translation and, this is the devil interpretation of this verse. I hope that helps some of you. God bless you.